I'm here with Christina Ergas today, professor of sociology with an emphasis on environmental sociology at the University of Knoxville, Tennessee. Dr. Ergas studies many areas of environmental sociology. Her and I have worked together on issues concerning reproductive justice and what we might call impact, or how it is that issues of gender inequality and reproductive injustice can work to actually drive carbon dioxide emissions, for example. And Dr. Ergas also is engaged in issues of resilience and sustainability globally. Her forthcoming book is entitled Surviving Collapse. In addition to that, she teaches classes at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, that are based on science fiction podcast, How to Survive the End of the World. So she might have some very interesting insights for us about these uncertain times that we're in. With that, I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Ergas here. And Professor Ergas, maybe you can begin by giving us just a general sense of what it is you do and how it is you approach issues of reproductive justice, gender inequality, and the environment in a broad sense.
Thanks, Dr. Grainer. So my forthcoming book, I'll just talk a little bit about that. I would say that the focus of my research isn't necessarily reproductive justice, but one of the things that I do look at are the ways in which the social aspects of sustainability affect the broader whole of sustainability. So when people talk about sustainability, they usually talk about sort of the three legs of sustainability. They often call it the three E's. So equity, environment, and economy. And so I like to focus on the equity piece for the most part. In my forthcoming book, though, I look at various social movements that are doing sort of more prefigurative type of work towards ameliorating environmental harm. So some of the things I'm looking at are instances of eco-villages that are just trying to be the change, right? That's kind of the idea behind what they're doing. They want to live in more egalitarian and more environmentally friendly types of situations, and so they just make it for themselves and they try to create it. And in some ways they can be somewhat seem like they're trying to sort of disassociate themselves from the society on the whole, because in a lot of ways their values are very much in opposition to the dominant society, but not always entirely and not necessarily. In a lot of ways they try to engage people in their community by teaching them things like how to do permaculture, which is a more environmentally or ecosystem centered form of agriculture. They try to engage their community in various workshops to help sustain people's emotional well-being and their social connections and community bonds. And they do a lot of in the ways of like having potlucks and things like that to really engage community. But that's just one case. And actually, so I sort of the tagline, or one of the lines I just recently thought of about how to promote this book is to call it sort of like a real utopian storytelling for the climate apocalypse. So yeah, so and that's not the only case. The other case that I look at is urban agriculture in Cuba. And Patrick, you mentioned that some of your students are from Cuba or have recent immigrant family from Cuba. I am in the same boat. My family, my mother's from Cuba, and it's interesting to think about the political dynamics here versus there. But I would say that they're more community oriented in Cuba than they are in the United States generally, and that has very different outcomes in terms of how people relate to each other and the environment. And in some ways, it offers some more resilience than things that we have here as well. And I just want to give a specific example. In the United States, you can do a lot if you have a lot of money. Right? You can do anything. You can get the best doctors. You can go anywhere in the world. You can have anything you want, right? Mm-hmm. But if you don't have a lot of money, which is the case for most people in the United States, then you don't have access to a lot. Cuba differs in that obviously it's an island nation that doesn't have access to a lot of resources. And then geopolitically, there's also the issue of the inequality between nations as well. And of course, the embargo imposed from the United States. But what Cubans have, and they're very rich in, that we are not rich in, is that even if they lack access to direct resources, they have community resources that make things more accessible to them. So, like, to give an example, in Cuba during hurricanes, you rarely hear of anyone dying or there being many fatalities, right? The reason for this is because their community looks out for them. So people will go and check on the disabled, the elderly, people with small children, to make sure that they have an escape route. In the United States, the people who die during hurricanes tend to be the elderly, the disabled, the people who don't have access to a way out, and especially people who are poor and have a lack of monetary resources that can help them escape as well. So in that way, community resources can actually help to buffer, what you might consider sort of monetary or even environmental resources in some of those cases. So anyway, I'm looking in that book at more of the community-oriented aspects of sustainability and the ways in which different, more egalitarian relationships help to bolster sustainability and resilience in different situations. So that's kind of the idea of that book. And one of the things too that I want to put forward mostly is that prior to this interview, you and I were actually talking about whether or not policy is the best way to go about change, or whether or not there might be more radical approaches or transformative approaches to change. And one of the things that I really want to do with that book is say, we have a major existential crisis on our hands, climate change, and and not just climate change, but all the things that come with that, right? I think all of our problems are interconnected. When I think of extreme social inequality, I see that as highly interconnected with environmental harm. And the rise of fascism, I think, is related. I think all of these things, these negative things, are really highly interconnected. And if you think about social inequality as the uneven distribution of environmental harms and environmental goods, what you have is a situation where you have people on the bottom who don't have access to a lot of resources, things like clean air and water even, right? And all of those good resources are being funneled to some small minority of people at the top who happen to have the most money, have access to the most power. And all of that funneling of clean and good everything is going up to the top. And all of the waste and detritus and everything bad just is funneled down to the bottom. And that's what inequality physically, materially looks like. You can think about it in terms of who lives closest to waste dumps, who lives in places that are most prone to disaster because of climate change or a variety of environmental catastrophes, who has access to good food, good quality food, clean air, clean water, things like that. So in this way, the point of what I'm saying is that the problems are so big, they're huge even. And some people, and when I say existential crisis, I mean people believe that humans are on a path towards collapse, real actual collapse, either civilization collapse or large-scale population decline, or any number of horrific things. And so what I'm saying is the problems are so big that we have to be really creative. Right now is not the time to focus on minutia like mini reform. I think we have to be more creative and think a lot bigger than that. And I know that that's daunting and that's a hard thing to hear and a hard thing to think about. But some of the people who are the most inspirational to me are people who are doing things that you wouldn't even believe that people could do, right? So I think what I want to do is to challenge people to think big and to be more creative.
No, I think that's an important message, especially I think the complexity, right, or the wickedness, as some people might say, of the problem. And really it is a problem, though we approach it a lot of times as a series of smaller, disconnected or disparate problems. And that's, I think, a way that a lot of times we sort of just compound these issues, right? Because we try to fix one thing at a time as if it's not affecting all these other things that we're also trying to deal with. Your book sounds so amazing. I'm so excited for it. And, you know, I kept wanting to jump in while you were talking to take it in a different direction. There's so many routes we could go in terms of talking about things. I'm particularly interested in this idea of equity and community, right? And I suppose you could say solidarity in many ways. When you say community, that's really kind of what I mean when I say community. And in particular, how that contributes to resilience and what that means for a world that is experiencing rapid shifts, really, like they would say in the science community, nonlinear transitions, right, in environmental spaces. And you mentioned hurricanes and who it is suffers most from those, and I immediately thought about heat waves, which are common natural disasters right now, but they're kind of quiet, slow disasters. We don't pay much attention to them often. And the very same populations that you discussed or described as being most vulnerable to hurricanes are most vulnerable to heat waves as well. And, Eric Kleinenberg is a sociologist who's real famous for his work on the Chicago heat wave. And pretty recently, he came out with some work that I think, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it aligns pretty well with what you were discussing about community solidarity in Cuba, where he suggests that one of the big things we need to be focusing on, and this is something that can exist, I think, within the realm of policy and outside of it simultaneously, right, is to actually build social infrastructures and these kind of lines of solidarity and community, so that we're not leaving people behind, right, or letting people fend for themselves in the face of, again, some of the most daunting, wicked challenges that we've ever experienced. And I mean, in Cuba, I think you've got a good sense of what those models look like. I'd love to hear more of kind of what you think gives rise to some of that deeper connection that they have with one another, and that deeper community care and engagement. And maybe if you think it's possible, like talk a bit about how it is, whether it's in line with Kleinenberg's idea of social infrastructure or not, how it is we could kind of port some of that beneficial communitarian ethic over to the United States. As for the most part, that's where we're all living here.
Yeah, no, those are a lot of good questions. It's so interesting and sort of complicated in this way that what I think you have are somewhat models of just completely different orientations towards social interaction. In the United States, I would call hyper-individualistic. And certainly there have been examples of plenty of societies that are sort of hyper-communitarian. And both, I think, pose problems, right? People describe hyper-communitarianism as being really oppressive to any sort of individuality or creativity outside of what the social norms are in a particular situation. But hyper-individualism is oppressive also in different ways, and maybe in ways in which people that are more insidious, and that maybe people sort of don't recognize as easily. Like in particular, loneliness is a really huge problem in the United States. And in fact, one of the biggest killers in the United States are deaths of despair. Yes. Aside from, actually dying from heart disease or things like that. Young people die from deaths of despair. Deaths of despair are symptomatic of extreme loneliness. Loneliness causes a lot of not only mental harm, but physical harm. People who are lonely tend to die younger. They tend to get sicker. And I saw reports that loneliness is as damaging to your health as smoking, 2 packs of cigarettes a day, basically, for your whole adult life.
Wow, I had not seen that. That's scary.
Yeah, loneliness is really bad for you. And it's really common in the United States. And deaths of despair are an example of what happens, which, are suicides, deaths from drug overdoses, things like that. But anyway, the other part of the problem with loneliness, it's hyper-individualism, is not just what it does to somebody's individual psyche and how it isolates us and things like that, but it also creates limited capacity to reach out. People don't take advantage of offers for help from other people. They don't feel like they can. They don't feel like they can ask for things like, rather than asking somebody to help you move, you might hire movers instead. Like all of our relationships become transactional, basically.
Absolutely. See.
And in that way, if you don't have money and you don't feel like you can reach out, or you don't feel like you have community or people who would be there to help you out, then you're really put in a situation of not having really anywhere to turn. And so I think absolutely this sort of, and I forget the terminology you used because I'm not sure that I've read that paper yet, which I need to. But I think that creating those networks is absolutely necessary. And in the United States, and I think Cubans sort of do that more culturally and naturally, which for a variety of reasons. I think that was one of the questions that you asked actually too, is how or why they do that. I mean, part of it is, you know, the revolution was very much, well, communist, but a socialist revolution. It was about having a more communitarian oriented perspective towards each other and society on the whole. So in that way, I think that that's part of it. But I think there too, people, there's some solidarity in relationship to feeling like sort of the underdog. That's part of the ethos of the revolution. You have this big Goliath, the United States, right next to Cuba, who's an imperial power, who's been trying to take over resources, and who has had access to those resources in the past, and who continues to want to do things to dominate or control Cuban politics. And so in that way, I think there's some solidarity from people who see themselves as needing to work together in order to stave off this bigger, powerful entity, right? But I mean, there's a lot of other things too. I'm sure a lot of it has to do with older cultural phenomena that I may not be as much aware of, you know? So I think that that's likely part of it. But in the United States, there are some examples of people doing that kind of social networking type of work. There's certainly mutual aid organizations that exist here. And I think that those are in that similar ethos of trying to create the social framework that the networks to be able to help each other out in whatever means people need to help each other out. But yeah, absolutely, especially for communities who don't have a lot of money resources, human resources are absolutely what they need to be able to maintain or be resilient in the face of a variety of oncoming disasters.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think, especially for Cuba's kind of broader or more widespread sense of solidarity, the fact I suppose that they've been in an embargo for so long, and they're a small island nation where it really, I would imagine, effectively cultivates this sense of kind of like, well, we are what we've got, you know. I could certainly see that. And you know, the rest of the world is engaged to some sense, like you point out, in this process of community support, but we've sort of hidden it under the market, right? And so all of our interactions, all of our reliance on each other is sort of tucked away behind the monetary exchange that we make with one another. Yeah, I think that's a really, for me, that's a really helpful, powerful point. I think
I
it's
want to
like,
add to that. Oh,
oh,
sorry.
go for it. No, go ahead.
I want to add to that because I just read this book again, and I always forget how brilliant some people are. You know, like I put down the book and I think, oh, that was amazing, and then I come back to it years later and I'm like, wow, it's still amazing. I was rereading Maria Mia's. She wrote a book with Madonna Shiva called Ecofeminism, and it was written in 1994, but I guess they've had a couple of editions come out since then. Anyway, there's a part where Maria Mia's writes, and she just says it so, she just articulates it perfectly. She says within capitalism, it's hard to have solidarity because most people's interests, if you're thinking about the rational individual who's seeking their own personal interests, most people's interests are actually antagonistic towards each other. So specifically, she uses the example of how it's hard to have a feminist worldwide solidarity because a lot of the people who are making things in sweatshops that we consume as affluent Westerners are poor rural or poor women in the global South.
Right.
And it's in our interest for prices to remain low as affluent shoppers in the global North, but it's not in those women's interest to be paid hardly anything, right? So if we were to have real solidarity, we would have to deny our own personal interests, our own gain, which is a communitarian ethos, right? It's not an individualistic ethos. We would have to deny our self-interest of getting things for cheap so that they could make a living wage. So in that way, it sets up that exchange relationship, sets up a necessary antagonism. and sort of severs the ability to have real connection and solidarity.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me of, in some of our work together, we talk a little bit about the feminization of globalization, right? And the fact that in so many instances, when women are initially being brought into labor forces in many areas of the world where they've been kept out of the labor market for so long, the section, or we could say the sector, I guess, of the labor force that they're allowed into are the ones that are most environmentally harmful, and the ones that also tend to be most lucrative for that reason, right? Because there's no labor or environmental oversight. They tend to be situated in export processing zones where everything is set up basically to maximize the amount of profit you're able to get from production processes and labor processes. And in many ways, I mean, these are like work camps for the women who work among them. And yeah, absolutely, that all works to our benefit. And that's something that, again, through the market, it's so easy to forget, right? That in this class, a lot of the discussion that we've had has centered on a lot of the unseen connections between ourselves and the rest of the world that we're embedded in. So how it is that the devices that we're using to talk right now or to watch this video later on are, connected to many problems that are ongoing in, say, the Congo Basin. But they're also connected to this increasing kind of ever-growing use of energy as we feel the need to store more and more pictures of what it is we eat, or what have you. And they're also, though, in that sense, connected to all these like broad processes of land use change. This is something that we've talked about quite a lot. Like when we search on our phone, we're not just using the power of our phone, but we're connecting to these servers that, again, are incredibly energy intensive, but also take up a lot of physical space. This is not as small as we tend to think it is. Anyway, so I just think this is one more good example of this. When we think of women's oppression around the world, it's so easy to forget how it is that we are implicated in those processes, particularly when it comes to things like environmental justice. And we can think of, I'm forgetting the name of the city. I think it's Qisheng, China, where they process most of the world's e-waste still, which is another connection. And most of that work is done by children and women, as again, is feminized labor, right? And so we can kind of see from our position here, as like you said before, this big behemoth of sort of consumption and trade, how it is we sprawl out to all these issues of both environmental change and really social domination in many senses. And so, yeah, I mean, how we go about changing that really does become tough without really dramatically altering our lifestyles in some way or another. But I do think, personally, I think there's a lot of promise in the strategy that you suggest, right? In a way that is as minimally disruptive as possible to bring about change through kind of relying on each other, building local communities and local systems of exchange, right? Like this is the logic underlying the local food movement, right? Or the buy local movement. But of course, that on its own still becomes difficult because, if people are being brought into the market and no longer able to carry out subsistence labor, say, around the globe, again, primarily something that women are engaged in, then, how is it that they're supposed to survive once we all start to buy local? And so, yeah, I don't have answers to these things, which I try to always be clear with my students. But I think it's worth thinking about. And this does get to this question, right, of how it is we go about reproducing ourselves. And that, of course, is deeply tied to how it is we go about reproducing our social world, our lives, and our social ties. And to that end, I suppose, like, we could ask, or I'll ask you, what do you think we could say is the role of gender equity in this in particular, which we've sort of started to touch on, but haven't dove into in particular. So like, how is it that the reproduction of these social processes that ultimately are leading to environmental change, to the spread and kind of deepening of social inequality. How is it that that is in some sense tied to gender inequality?
So your question seemed to have multiple parts, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure exactly what you're asking specifically. So maybe you could
Oh, I'm
rephrase
sorry.
it just for me. Yeah, just a
Well,
little
let's
bit.
just focus on this last part that I ended at, which is where is it that gender equity fits into this, what it is we're talking about, right? To building a broader sense of community, and so part of the reason it seemed like the question had multiple parts is because I was slowly trying to roll into the concept of reproductive justice as well, but reproductive justice in like a big R reproductive justice sense. So like how it is we go about reproducing the world that we occupy. And I think it's easy to kind of, in a more like classical sense of how we use the term reproductive labor, for example, to understand how that's tied to gender equity, as like historically most women or most reproductive labor has been carried out by women. But I'm also interested, and this is my question, kind of, in understanding how it is that on this broader scale of how it is we go about like shaping the world in a way that ultimately causes social inequality and environmental change, or we could say environmental justice, is tied to gender equity. Or another way of saying it is, what kind of opportunity is there to try to address some of these problems through getting rid of gender inequality?
Yeah, that is a question that has, I think, many, many answers. So I'm going to try to focus on a couple of dimensions of it, I think. So something I appreciate about what ecofeminists try to do, and of course, David Pellow does this more too in his book, Total Liberation, and a bit in Critical Environmental Justice also, but is looking at the way in which we have these certain narratives, or we've constructed these ways of knowing and understanding the world that legitimize hierarchy and social inequality. But that these hierarchies, and these hierarchies are very old. They've been established through religion and through the scientific revolution. There are a variety of processes that help to establish some of these social hierarchies. But if you think about the hierarchy specifically that they're talking about, it's usually sort of this Western elite white man sort of at the top. And then the environment, everything is sort of subsumed into the environment that's not human, right at the bottom. But that orientation towards the world, this sort of legitimized form of hierarchies that we have, that they allow for, like I said before, that funneling of resources to go to the top of that particular social hierarchy, and any sort of like waste or detritus or any sort of problems that occur from it are taken on by anybody at the bottom of the hierarchy, especially the environment, of course, various ecosystems, various animals, people who are more marginalized in our societies. So that's where the effects of that sort of ravaging ends up, right? And the thing that the ecofeminists specifically talk about is that this is a mentality, that we have a mentality that says it's okay, that it's perfectly legitimate to have one group of people dominate other groups of people. And this sort of hierarchical mentality allows for these problems to begin to in the first place. Because if we didn't have this mentality, if we saw any others, right? Earth others, whether it be other animals, whether it be a tree, whether it be whatever, if we saw them as a being that we could have a relationship with, as somebody that we do have a relationship with, because we do have relationships with even things that people don't think they have relationships with, right? Trees obviously do a variety of things. They cleanse the air, they release oxygen, we breathe in oxygen. We're constantly relating to other beings all of the time, even if we take it for granted or don't notice it, right? And if we instead approached each other with that sort of understanding and that kind of respect and that sort of general ability to connect or relate, then we likely wouldn't see the kinds of harms that we see to this day. And I know that sounds kind of abstract, but I feel like I want to give some other examples.
Can I jump? Can I
Yeah.
jump in? No, I mean, in some sense, it is like a kind of abstract, hand wavy thing when you first start to think about it. But then, I also think there's many sort of concrete examples of how we like bring this in, even if we don't acknowledge its ties to ecofeminism. So you think about like the move in economics and in a lot of the policy world to say like, well, the way that we fix this is by internalizing externalities. And that's a way basically of saying that we have to recognize these relationships that we've previously ignored or we thought didn't exist or didn't matter, right? Like you talk about the tree and the idea that the tree is not just sitting there as a tree, right? It's actually like engaged in this process of respiration along with us, and we kind of in that sense are co-constituting one another. And so again, because I guess going back to our earlier conversation, we just like catch everything in these market processes. It's easy to mess that unless there's a cost associated to it in some way or another. And what the cost is and how you distribute it is, again, like a wicked problem. We're not really equipped to understand that, I think, in most instances, right? When you were talking, I kept thinking about Kyle White's work on, reciprocal relationships of responsibility and cultures of continuance and cultures of disruption. And just thinking about that in light of ecofeminist work, the way you described it, it kind of makes it seem fairly clear that much of the Western culture that we like have spread through globalization is, or it could be characterized as a culture of disruption in that sense, right? One that ignores these reciprocal relationships of responsibility. So it's interesting to think of how that is tied to these issues or the development, I suppose, of gender inequalities.
And fosters disconnection. Like I said before, when we talked about relationships, of economic relationships are necessarily antagonistic. You can't be connected to somebody who you're in competition with in that way, and that you have competing interests with.
Right. Or can you be responsible for someone you're exploiting or something you're exploiting? Yes. That's an interesting tension. Yeah.
It is interesting. Well, and I wanted to add another example to this because this is something that seems that I imagine people don't realize even this connection, but I read about it recently and this still bothers me to this day. So, as a result of climate change, another sort of dual problem is ocean acidification because of the excessive release of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the ocean is a major sequester or sort of sink for carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. Anyway, as a result, it's causing the ocean's pH to change. And as it acidifies, a variety of problems occur. Not only is it acidifying, it's getting hotter, right? And so there are a variety of species in the ocean that can't survive the acidification and can't survive the excessive heat. And one species that's sensitive to it are phytoplankton. And phytoplankton may seem like something that you are completely disconnected to as a human being. But phytoplankton actually creates 70% of the oxygen that's in the atmosphere. If the phytoplankton die off, then everything that breathes oxygen is likely to die off with it.
Right. Yeah. We talk a lot about how we ignore these things that aren't easy to kind of like wrap our heads around, almost like these distributed objects. So it's easy for us to talk about the Amazon and say, we've got to protect the Amazon. That's the lungs of the world, because we can point to it on a map and think about it this way. But all these microorganisms that, contribute to our continual health and well-being. I mean, COVID has kind of brought this to light in some ways, right? Also can't be ignored, but it's much easier for us to wrap our head around it. I think it's interesting to think about that too. Such a good example, the phytoplankton. Thank you for bringing it up. In terms of our in many ways, in the United States, failed response to COVID-19, and the fact that it's difficult for people to understand these microorganisms as an object that they're in relationship with, as they just visibly can't see them. They can't
Or a
sense them.
subject.
Oh,
Yeah.
or a subject. Yeah, even better. Thank you.
Well, so when I think about these disconnections, I think about them in a lot of ways. You know, Kyle White does a good job to talk about, or specifically talks about certain tribal communities in the United States, or what is now known as the United States. Obviously, it wasn't. I think for his people, it was the Turtle Island. Anyway, in terms of their reciprocal relationships, also one of my favorite authors too is a woman who is from, I think, the same set of nations that he's from. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if you've read that book, but she very much talks about the reciprocity and the relationships with plants specifically. It's a book about the importance of learning from plants.
Wow.
And yeah, it's so good on so many levels, but so interesting. But she talks about how plants are much older than us, and that for her people, they saw humans, well, they are, in terms of evolution, we're really young. We're actually a very young species. And a lot of plants are much, much older than we are. And so she talks about how, from her people's perspective, we actually know nothing, and how we should look to plants to learn and to understand what's going on in the world, basically. So the book is about the teaching of plants. So I don't remember why I got on this train. The disconnection. Actually, I was thinking a lot about, and this is something I grapple with quite a lot, thinking about the relationships that settler colonialism, and also, just generally capitalism as a global sort of economic system does. Part of its job is severing connections. If you think about like people's relationships to land, because you were talking about subsistence laborers, that relationship to land that people have is so fundamental. It's so primary. In order for you to be able to sustain your life, you have to have some connection to land, right? Like you have to have somewhere to live. You have to have somewhere to grow food, somewhere to get water, somewhere to just enjoy being, right? To exist, right? Like all of that requires a relationship to land, even if a lot of people don't feel that way because their primary relationship seems to be their relationship to their computer. In actuality, you have to have that computer be somewhere, right? So, and all of that computer is made up of entirely resources that come from the land. So in terms of severing those connections, it's a really important project for capitalism to sever those connections, because if people who can take care of themselves, who can subsist and live off the land, they're not very good consumers because they don't have to buy much, right? There's not that necessity to buy food. You don't have to work a job you don't like, right? You can say, no, I don't want this job. I'm gonna go and grow my own food and live somewhere in the woods and just be left alone. Like I would rather have that situation than work in this sweatshop or work in this mine or do whatever else that could be health damaging or really just back-breaking forms of labor that are not. It's so funny. I want to say this in so many different ways, and I'm having trouble saying it in a way that I feel like is really articulate. I've had a lot of jobs I hated, so I think that's kind of the idea. You don't want to work a job that you hate, right? And especially working for somebody who doesn't appreciate that you're there and who doesn't care about you as a person, and who will allow you to be in harm's way in order to do the labor to get somebody else's profit, right? And in those ways, so that severing of connections to the land is really important for capitalism. It's also really important, again, to sever a lot of community relationships, because people who have community relationships also don't have to rely on as many consumable resources. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about hyper-individualization, and how what that means is that things that you would normally get from your community, you now purchase, right? And that's, going back to the gender question, that's social reproduction, really, very simply thought about or put in that way, is that social reproduction, usually performed by women, of course not always, but usually performed by women, is everything in the way of not just physical reproduction of life, and that's giving birth and things like that, but and caring for children, but it's also caring for other people. It's caring for people in your community. It's caring for the elderly. It's caring for the ill. It's caring for the family, cooking food, doing domestic labor, doing subsistence labor. A lot of that is care work. And even in that way now, especially in the West or the global North, a lot of that care work is also commodified. And I go back and forth onto whether or not that's a good thing. Obviously, we don't want people to be in the situation where they're not valued and they're not remunerated for their work. Mm-hmm. But maybe we also don't want to be in a system where we show value by paying people. Maybe we can show value in other ways, right? And then there are plenty of examples of cultures that show value to people in their communities in other ways that are not money, right? So,
yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question, I think, that's brought up by the sort of reproductive justice literature that I think about a lot when I'm reading it. Like going all the way back to Margaret Benston, I think, who first like started to talk about social reproduction and social or reproductive labor. And, you know, one of the things that interesting point she brought up for me was that for productive labor, you know, we forget that this used to take place in the home as well, you know, or used to take place basically among familial units or small community units. And we kind of brought the whole weight of society down onto productive labor to make it as efficient as we could. But we never have done that for reproductive labor. We've always left that individualized and left it to the family. Maybe if people are particularly lucky, but like we say, this doesn't really happen in the United States, maybe we've also left it to the community. And I think there's an interesting tension there, because in some sense it's saying like we should industrialize everything. And I'm not sure that I'm 100% positive that that's the solution either, right? To say like we should have big giant mess halls that people can go to. This might be beneficial, right? In terms of controlling like our energy use to some degree and making sure that everybody's able to access meals and everything. But still, for a lot of the reasons we've been talking about earlier, in terms of like the people that live on the borders of these, going to Laura Polito's border, work on border thinking. For them, this requires that they be pulled in as well. Like a kind of, it's still engaging in this broader culture of disruption, I guess, if we think about it that way. And so, again, I don't have answers, but it's just something that occasionally rattles around in the back of my head, and it makes me a little uncomfortable, if that makes any sense. So I think we should probably begin to wrap this up for the sake of time. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I did want to get your advice, if I could, on one last question from a student that I think is an important one, that I think actually comes up in a lot of both of our work, especially when it comes to kind of quantifying the impact of gender inequality. And that is a question concerning how it is that these issues of reproductive labor, especially when we talk about them in terms of men and women, fit or don't fit non-gender conforming people into, well, I guess into the conversation. So particularly like we've been discussing or reading Kathy Cook's work on women as the first environment, and discussing this in kind of a biological sense. This seems to like push out trans women, for example. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that for a minute.
Yeah, that's an interesting question for a variety of reasons. I sort of look at this situation historically. I think queer identities, for the most part, in our understanding of them now, our current understanding is a very new understanding. Clearly, there have been cultures that have had non-binary gender identities. We can talk about sort of third genders, or you know, I can't remember the one. Kyle White talks about the indigenous version of it too. I forget what they call them though now, for some reason. That's bothering me.
I don't know off the top of my head either, but yeah, I know what you're getting at, I think.
Yeah, so obviously there have been non-binary gender identities forever for many communities throughout history. But Western culture is very binary with its understanding of gender. And that's important because that's where ecofeminism's sort of um, what their intervention is to say, we've created this binary. And in fact, ecofeminism, one of the things that it tries to do is deconstruct the very binaries that exist within sort of Western thought, that coming from, you know, Judeo-Christian backgrounds, but also from the scientific revolution. And these binaries are constructed in such a way that they're hierarchical, again, with that hierarchical thinking, right? Mm-hmm. So these binaries aren't just man and woman, though that is one of the binaries that they specifically are addressing and talking about. But the binaries that are also constructed are society, nature, black, white, you know, civilized, indigenous, right? These are binaries that were created to say that there's one group that's right or better, and there's another group that's lesser than. And I think for ecofeminism, specifically looking at that binary and looking at sort of male and female in that way, or looking at the sex differences in that way, is important because these binaries were constructed from, you know, the scientific revolution on, and prior to that, a little bit prior to that. And that these were the ways of legitimizing that direction, that flow of resources that I was talking about earlier. And so in women in that way, their bodies were very much seen as a resource. This is how you get laborers. This is how you get somebody to care for you when you're ill, or to care for the children, because you need those things to happen in a society. All of those things have to happen in order for us to reproduce ourselves. And if you can control the unit that does that, the subject, the object, actually it would be in this view, then if you can control them, then you're able to get those resources whenever you want to. And actually, this is interesting and important because I think it sort of speaks to the fact that why a lot of queer identities are so, the way that we understand them now are such recent developments. Because women weren't allowed to be anything but women prior. The witch burnings, actually, I don't know if you all read anything about the witch burnings, but ecofeminists do talk about the witch burnings quite a lot in Western Europe, in England especially. The witch burnings were meant to put women in their place. They could only be one thing. They had to be demure, they had to be submissive, they had to be mothers, and they couldn't be owners of property. All of the women who were burned during the witch trials were women who had acquired some property, were women who had previously been midwives, or who had previously been healers of some kind. Any women who acted in any way that they weren't supposed to act. So if they were too talkative, too stubborn, too, you know, they didn't act like a woman, what they constructed like a woman was supposed to act like, those were all fair game for the witch trials. And people would accuse them of witchcraft, and then they would be burned at the stake. And I don't think people understand how big the witch trials were. We're talking about something on the order of, so I've seen different estimates, but the estimates are between hundreds of thousands and millions of women burned.
And just the time scale too. We think about like the Salem witch trials in the United States and this like moment, but really it was like centuries long.
Centuries long. And so our binary constructions of gender that exist today exist because of the witch trials. Mm-hmm. And so women being the original environment, that's the reason, because women could only be this one thing. They could only be reproducers of life. And if they were anything else, if they deviated in any way, they were burned at the stake. So I think that the ways in which we understand non-binary and queer identities now, just if you think about the history of it, those couldn't even enter the conversation because non-binary identity had been eradicated. through centuries of burnings. And not just for women. In fact, the other people who were burned too, if men were burned, they were burned because they were not masculine enough.
That's such a powerful place to end. I especially like thinking about that in terms of that you say ordering the flow of things or the flow of goods throughout society and the world. And in that sense, I think we could probably connect that moment to the other moments of like the making of our modern world, like settler colonization and the development of African enslavement and the African slave trade and race in that sense, just as with gender. And I suppose with that, I want to thank you so much for your insights and powerful commentary. And yeah, we appreciate you, Dr. Ergas. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.